You know, it's a changing world, and one of the things that help us understand the changing world is research. And so as churches have been struggling and families may be disconnected and sometimes drifting away from the church, we're kind of dealing with some of the questions of where do we go from here? And the Communio nationwide survey on faith and relationships really kind of points to the family decline and how it relates to faith decline in the United States. Actually, the survey has 3 key issues that are impacting our society today. Go to communio.org/study to download the nationwide study on faith and relationships.
The Eric Geiger Leadership Podcast is part of the Church Leaders Podcast Network, which is dedicated to resourcing leaders to face the complexities of ministry. The Church Leaders Podcast Network supports pastors and ministry leaders by challenging assumptions, providing insights, and offering practical steps that will help them navigate a variety of cultures and contexts. Learn more at ChurchLeaders.com/podcast network.
The first 100 days, you've heard that in reference to a new political leader who's moved into a new position. Your first 90 days, perhaps you've had someone say, hey, how are you going to lead in your first 90 days in your new role? In fact, the first 90 days is a book that is often given out by human resource departments and managers. It's a HBR, Harvard Business Review book, The First 90 Days by Michael Watkins. Actually, we'll reference that several times in today's episode. But the reason the phrase of the first 100 days or the first 90 days has gained so much traction is we do intuitively know that how a leader begins is really so important, at least for the first several years. And so in this episode, we want to talk about the first season. We won't limit it to 90 days, but the first 3 months, 6 months, maybe even the first year of the successor's tenure. How does the leader think about the new context that he or she has found themselves in? What's their approach to leadership? And so instead of me interviewing me, because I'm the successor in this example, I thought I would hand the microphone over to Kenton, let him ask me questions about how I thought through the first season, my first season here at Mariners Church. Kenton has coached and is still coaching lots of leaders, lots of pastors, and so he gets asked this question a lot. So Kenton, ask me, what do you get asked about how I led, or how should a leader lead? You know, how can we think about the first season of a new leader's job?
So I would think, as you interviewed and then you got to know Mariners, I mean, clearly we thought we knew our strengths, we thought we knew our weaknesses, but no one knows them perfectly. And then you had to come in and you had insight. You saw things and you knew that there's probably some of the things we got right, some of the things we got wrong. But in your mind, you're going, okay, these are things that I'll want to see change. These are things that I'll want to do. What matrix did you use? How did you decide? How did you think about coming in, knowing that you got 100 days and you got to chart a course and they got to understand who you are, what your leadership's like. So how did you figure it out?
Well, theologically, I think I can learn from some organizational models, you know, that all truth is God's truth from Augustine, but that the church is not just an organization, that we are referring to the body of Christ, the family of God, the bride of Christ. And so how I speak of this church that God's called me to is going to be really important. And I have watched leaders from a distance for a long time, I think, just do transition. I'm not referring to you, the predecessor, but I'm referring to the successor, come in and announce things in such a way that feels so painful to the past. Now, the reason they probably do is they probably have read a leadership book that says, hey, if you're going to make change, you have to create dissatisfaction with the status quo. If you're going to create change, you have to create a sense of frustration with how things are. So that's common leadership advice. So they probably, I'm trying to assume the best of these leaders who have done this, they probably answer the question like, hey, I'm noticing some things I want changed, and so I need to get people riled up to make change, and so I need to speak with language that causes people to want to change.
But you didn't do that.
I think that's a mistake, even if you want to make change, unless everybody knows it's a turnaround.
Yes.
And Mariners Church was clearly not a turnaround. And I've even seen leaders in lots of churches basically kind of have the posture of, I'm here to fix this place, which is so prideful, as if we as leaders are the ones that make the church happen. I mean, Jesus is the one who builds his church. He's the one who keeps it.
But you want to feel needed, and you want to have a sense of calling.
That's why I think leaders do it, yeah.
So what's the line? So you go, fixing feels too hard.
Yeah.
Changing, even in a turnaround where we've agreed these things need to take place. Yes. But
I've led in a turnaround environment, and people who led, I have several people on our team here who led with me in previous places. So people that I've brought to join the team here, and they say, man, you are such a different leader now than you were then. And I say, because this wasn't a turnaround. So you asked about the framework. So in the first 90 days, the book that I referenced by Michael Watkins, he basically says, here's the gist. It's a long book. It's very helpful. But if you want the cliff notes, it's leaders have to assess the context of the organization that they have moved into and then match their leadership to that context. And so here's he puts all organizations in one of four buckets, and it could really follow what some call the life cycle of an organization. So you have a startup, and that's when, that's the beginning of the curve. Then a realignment, which means the organization's grown, the church has grown, but there's some things that over time, no one's at fault. Things just get out of alignment, just like your car does. So that the organization needs some realignment. After it successfully realigns, it typically has a growth spurt, a season of great success, and that is then what Watkins calls sustaining success. And then, though, if the organization doesn't continue to innovate, if the church doesn't decide, hey, we're going to stay on mission and reach people, it declines and then becomes in need of a turnaround. So startup, realignment, sustained success, and turnaround. And the leadership of the leader has to be matched to that context.
So what's the key phrase for startup?
So how do you lead differently, essentially?
Yeah.
So for both startup and turnaround, think about it this way. Even though it's 4, you could even almost go to 2, although there is some distinction. Startup and turnaround requires a hunter, and realignment and sustaining success requires a farmer. So both hunters and farmers eat. It's just hunters have to kill something today to eat today. Farmers plant today to eat 6 months from now. And so I believe that there were parts of Mariners that was probably realignment, some things that needed to be tweaked, but that the overall majority of Mariners was a sustained success. And I decided that I was only going to speak about, in fact, this is the first time I've ever told anybody that I can remember that there were parts of Mariners that I thought was realignment. I told everybody that Mariners was sustained success and wanted to speak of you, speak of the past, as a sense of this is, again, not a perfect church, but a beautiful church. So Watkins would say sustained success, you need to have more learning and more defense. By defense, he means you really value what is, and you champion the values of the past, you hold on to the values of the past, while a turnaround also requires defense, but you're protecting the core, but you're moving so fast, you're just attempting, that's a turnaround. A startup is more offense because you don't have anything to defend yet, you're just starting, but it's also more doing. But both a realignment and a sustained success, we'll put a link to this in the show notes, but both a realignment and a sustained success require a farmer, listener, moving slower, and that was my posture when I came here.
And you did that. And what I liked about it is as you showed up on the weekends, it hugely impacts the weekends, because if you have to show up as somebody who's turning it around, that would affect how you'd speak on the weekend, or if you felt like it was new. But the way that you spoke, even taught, preached on the weekends, had that kind of sustaining, we have what we're doing, we're moving forward in this. And then the people felt that, and it felt gentle to them in some ways.
Yes, I wanted it to feel like I am so thankful to be a part of this. And this is still true, but especially those early months and year. I'm so thankful to be a part of this community, and I'm going to teach from within this community, and we're going to do what Mariners has always done. We're going to teach God's word. And I mean, you remember, Kenton, with the staff, this is the language I used with them more than with the church. I said, I'm going to run your playbook. Mariners has a strategy. I'm going to run your playbook. In time, I'm sure I'll phrase things a bit differently, but I came here, I love the values. So Mariners had a set of values. We have values and we have a strategy, right? Mission, values, and strategy, all of those were already in place. Since being here now 4 years, mission is still the same as it was 4 years ago. Values have been restated, reclarified, but I waited till year 3 to do that. Mm-hmm. And then strategy, we added a little bit to the strategy.
But you made it yours. Yes. But I like that. But I think that, so in the beginning, you spoke to the staff and said, I'm going to run your playbook. How did you feel like that worked, and how did they respond to that? And how did the church? The church heard it less, but the staff heard it. I saw you say it to the staff.
I think it lowered defense.
I think it did too.
Yeah. Is that what you?
Yeah, no, I think that they didn't feel like they had to protect. They didn't feel like they had to push back. They felt like, oh, good, you like me and you like what we were doing.
Which was totally true. It was true. So I wasn't just saying things that weren't authentic, right?
No, I think it was.
And I would say, again, I was matching my leadership to the context. So if you were going into a turnaround, when I led in a turnaround, I led very differently. But I always say this to leaders who go into a turnaround. Your ability to lead successfully in a turnaround is dependent on if the organization understands it's in a turnaround.
Yes.
So if you think it's a turnaround and people don't think it's a turnaround, there's a massive mismatch. I was brought into a situation when I was at Lifeway, but also when I was at a church in Miami that had just gone through a church split before I got there. In both times, there was a sense of there has to be a shift here. There must be a turnaround. You can lead that way. I had an executive coach the whole time that I was at Lifeway, and he really coached me through. So I met with him once a month for 7 years. So I mean, almost 100 times, right?
Wow.
For 3 hours at a time. So I mean, so this was significant investment in my life. I'm so grateful for Dr. Rayner, who's the CEO at Lifeway, who invested in me in that way. But he talked to me about when I was coming here. He said, "You've led a turnaround. This isn't a turnaround where you're going, and so there's a difference of opinion on can you lead in a non-turnaround situation."
Interesting.
He said there's a debate among leadership theorists that so it takes a farmer to lead a sustained success, and it takes a hunter or a warrior to lead a turnaround or a startup. Can a warrior be a farmer? And so he was just saying you need to think about
So he was asking you if you could be a farmer.
Yeah. As I was processing and praying coming here, he said, You've led in a turnaround. I've coached you through a turnaround. And I'm seeing you develop some other muscles because now you're on the other side of the turnaround. I remember at some point he said, you need to now declare the organization turned around because people can't live in the turnaround energy indefinitely or the startup energy indefinitely. So I wrestled with that when I came here, and I really believe I don't really want to live in turnaround all the time. Yeah. I remember telling him, man, Steve Graves is his name. Steve, I hope it's true that a leader can be either one, and the leader just out of humility is choosing either warrior or hunter or farmer based on the context, not because I would prefer to be a farmer than a hunter.
Right.
The long-term sustainability for my family, my life, the organization, I would love to not live in turnaround mode, you know?
No, and it's that old statement, if you're a hammer, everything's a nail. And so you can just start beating on things so hard. In my own experience, since the church I started at Mariners, it was small and it was a turnaround. And so I know that, and you work hard, but living in that isn't a place for a staff or people long-term, because and farming it's still hard and it's rigorous, but going to battle all the time and feeling that you're cornered in battle, you start to, I think you get weird if you start to think
in that classic book, The Art of War, the author, I always mispronounce his name, but he says that you can't keep troops on the front line forever.
No.
And so I remember telling the executive coach, man, I know you think I love this turnaround. Mm-hmm. It was a lot of sleepless nights. I mean, you're making really difficult, constant decisions, and you're having to put chips into the center of the table on strategic moves. Like, this has to work.
Right.
So,
and you feel like you're betting it all.
You're going all in.
That's right.
And I'm so grateful to not live that way when I came to Mariners.
So but even in farming, you have to make some choices and you have to lead.
Yes.
And
you have to plant in a field.
Right.
Yep.
And so you're doing that, and you're choosing language with the staff and you're leading them, but you've got to lead them forward in it. So how did it work? Did it work?
Yeah, I feel I think you might have thought I was moving too slowly at times.
No, I just wanted to make sure you felt comfortable to lead. So I constantly I wanted you always to feel permission from me to change.
Okay. Because you would say things like, hey, you should change something even just for the fact of changing.
Right.
So, I mean,
and that's partly true.
It was so liberating for me to have the predecessor tell me, hey, I want you to change some things. If I were you, I would change some things.
Right.
And so how do we move it? There's a leadership principle from Jim Collins that was really helpful called bullets before cannonballs. Mm-hmm. Essentially, especially in a sustained success environment, you don't have to go all chips in. Mm-hmm. So you have time. As you're planting, you can test some things. So shoot a bullet before you shoot a cannonball. Another way to say it in the tech space or the development space, it's a crawl, walk, run. So there were several things that I said, hey, can we test this? I'll just give a couple examples. So I knew that Rooted was really important, not only to Mariners, but to you. And I love Rooted. As you know, we've got 1,300 people in Rooted right now. Many of those groups will turn into life groups. I mean, it's just beautiful to see. And Rooted was a big part of the DNA at our church. There was, at the end of Rooted, which is a 10-week discipleship journey, there's a big celebration. It's awesome. It's epic. I mean, people meet Jesus that night. People get baptized. It's dinner. And it was on Friday nights. Well, years ago, I wrote a book called Simple Church, which you actually love Simple Church.
I do.
And I still believe in the principles of, like, if you have a strategy, don't program against your strategy. And Mariners had a strategy that we call it the transformational loop, which was, hey, we use our weekend services to help people follow Jesus. We use groups to help people grow together. Then we moved into serving one another and changing the world and outreach. But we were having this Friday night Rooted celebration outside of our loop program. And it was on Friday night. I viewed it as kind of competing with the weekend with our Saturday night services. So I asked two of our pastors, our experienced pastor and our discipleship pastor, we were at the Rooted celebration on a Friday night. And I said, hey guys, will you look at this through the lens of, could we integrate this into our Saturday night service? They're like, well, how on earth? I'm like, no, just think about it. What elements are happening at the celebration that are already happening in our service, and that we could then do the other elements before or after and have baptisms. And here's why. I want the church to see how amazing this is, and I want to integrate these people into the church. Can you just evaluate it, and then let's talk about it next week? So we met, and they said, I think we can try it. I said, now, I don't want to try it if you're trying to try it one time to prove to me that this is a dumb idea. I only want to try it if you believe we can make this work. And they're like, I think we can make this work. I think this is going to work. So then I went to you. And so I haven't told anybody on staff yet that we're doing this, just those two. And then I go to you and say, I want to try this, but I know it's tweaking something that's really, really important to you.
Yeah.
And you were, I mean, without even flinching, you were so supportive.
I was. Yeah, verbally. But in my heart,
inside you were dying.
No, and I remember how you worded it, and I thought it was genius because you said, now, because you said, what about it? So as soon as you started to ask the question, I'm going to say yes to whatever you're going to ask.
Wow.
Okay. So then you ask, and I'm like, really? Crap. Of all the things, that's what you're going to change?
Yeah.
I go change something. They go, that's what you're going to change?
Of all the things, you're messing with this.
Man. Right. But then you said, and I don't want you just to agree in it. You gave that line. And I thought, you know what? The most important thing is you've got to make some changes, and you've got to make the church yours. And I've got to step back and always embrace, it's not mine. It's not mine.
Yeah.
It's not mine. And so that was my journey, and it was important for me. And while I wouldn't have made that change because, I like the way that it is, and the way that you've done it is more, it's more integrated, and it's doing exactly what you said it would do. It's tied into Saturday, and the people get to connect with it. So it did everything that you wanted it to do. But what I like about it is I like that you did it. I like that you did it for your reasons. And I like that you let the staff kind of deal with it. But I'm sure for many people it was like, oh, wow.
Yeah.
Because it could have been a sacred cow.
Totally. It easily could have been a sacred cow.
And close to being it.
Yeah.
And so I liked that you were changing it. And I liked my response.
Your response was so liberating for me.
And that I did it, and I was able to just shut up and go, okay, yeah, all right, go ahead. And go, but at the same time that you did it and you made it yours.
Right.
And you won.
So that's one example. So even though I was a farmer, so being a farmer doesn't mean that you are not making calls.
No, you got to make calls.
You're still making calls. But if it had been a turnaround, I probably would have just declared it, not asked for a test.
Yeah, because the thing wouldn't have been working.
The thing wouldn't have been working.
You changed something that was working
That's right.
very well.
It was.
You just made it work differently.
Right.
And better for the overall system.
Yeah.
So that was good.
Yeah.
And I think that it made it work all through it because of your mindset towards farming. Staff all had it was easy for them and gentle and moving forward, and also for the people.
So that was 18 months. That was my first 18 months here. And then COVID hit, right? So obviously, there's articles that come out when COVID hits. I mean, I remember Andy Crouch wrote, it just went viral, this article. I remember so many friends, forwarded me the PDF or texting, have you read Crouch's article? Basically declaring every organization is now a startup.
Right.
Or every nonprofit is now a startup, because he's a part of a group that coaches entrepreneurs and Christian entrepreneurs and also not-for-profits. And that of course now we're on the other side of the succession because I've been here 18 months, but I then led differently during the COVID time as I led my first 18 months here.
Yeah, you had to. It was a whole different thing. How would you summarize the difference?
I in many ways led as a startup during COVID, but when I say lead as a startup, you have to be really careful because you're not starting a different organization.
Right.
You're building on the values of the past. You're affirming everything from the past that you want to see transferred to the future. So even when you do a turnaround, I would say, and it wasn't a turnaround because I was trying to change Mariners. The context of the whole world was different during that time. So that's why Crouch was saying every organization is a startup, that you just have to think differently. But even when you're thinking differently in that kind of leadership season, I think it's such a mistake for leaders to not affirm the past, because you want to bridge the past to to the future.
Well, it's all they know. So
Yeah.
if you don't give me something I can stand on,
That's right.
then I'm going. Anytime you introduce a change, mostly you want to say, here's the things that won't change. And
Right.
so that helps people go, okay, these things don't change. So you're not going to change the doctrine and theology
Totally.
and other beliefs. But the things that must change, there are so many things that had to change. You couldn't meet on weekends. So it's, what's a church? We're still a church. We're just not meeting the way we used to meet, shoulder to shoulder, sitting in rows in a building. But you had to meet.
Yeah, totally.
So it was all different.
It was different during that season. And then, by God's grace, some really cool, innovative things came out of that turnaround.
Right.
Not the turnaround, but the turnaround mentality. Mariners was not a turnaround ever since I've been here.
No, but you did some great things. I think what I was most proud of that you did is you went from the strategy from neighborhoods where the Mariners was meeting in neighborhoods to meeting in communities, and out of that,
new congregations.
Yeah, like 4 or
5.
5.
Yeah.
5, which was a huge thing,
Beautiful.
which wasn't a strategy starting off, but it was a step by step. It was okay, we have an opportunity and we're moving forward. But you changed the whole organization of the staff. So whatever people's job description was going into the pandemic, everybody got a different job description, and literally moved forward doing different things because the church was so different.
If you had a regular job depending on the weekend, and we weren't having weekend services for several months. I mean, we have some other things that we want. Our mission hasn't changed. We want to serve our community, inspire people to follow Jesus, and fearlessly change the world. And so there's things for us to do.
Right.
But even that goes with the iterative approach of crawl, walk, run. Right. So we used the pandemic to test some things and then scaled those things that worked. Right. And same kind of thing in the approach of, so there's leadership principles that transfer, whether it's sustained success or a turnaround, of proving faithful in a few things and then scaling those things.
Right. And some staff made it and some didn't based on the same, here was what was working.
Right.
If they could jump in and work it with you.
Yeah.
But if they didn't, then it's like, well, what are you going to do?
I think you have great. We had great people. Still have great people. You have great people who decide who loved working with you. Then I was going to be a different leader. Who helped during the transition, but we're going to still love our church, but perhaps move on and serve in a different. That they were grateful for the season that they had here.
Right.
And then there's others who perhaps they are built more for sustained success than a turnaround.
Right.
And when a pandemic hits, everyone had to operate in that season for a while,
And one of the things that I think is important and that you did well and the church did well is you don't make things right and wrong. You just make them different.
That's right.
So that people who had a great season and with me but needed to make a transition, you gave them the opportunity to make that transition, and it wasn't hard. It just is, okay.
And massively thankful for all they did.
Yeah. And then those that could, they moved forward and they found a way.
Yeah. And then God brings new leaders on as well.
That's right. Good.
Yeah.
Love it.
So, major takeaway for you, the successor. Assess properly the context of the ministry, church, or organization that you've moved into. Is it in need of turnaround leadership? Is it in need of sustaining leadership? Is it in need of you being a hunter or in need of you being a farmer? And I would not make that decision in isolation. Bring other people around the table and spend a lot of time in prayer and fasting. Don't let your bias to the kind of leadership you prefer to be what causes you to decide.
And I like that idea of getting a coach. And a coach in your context was you literally had one, but you can get coaches, two or three people who know you well that speak to that, because I think that there is, if you don't look at it accurately and you're not self-aware, you can easily fall into seeing something wrong.
I mean, think about how much pain you unnecessarily bring upon yourself and on the people you're called to serve if you misassess the situation.
Right.
If you bring turnaround leadership to a sustained success, that is disastrous. You are changing things, you're pulling triggers, you're declaring things when that is not the context that's not what's needed in that context, right? So be sure that it's not your bias that's causing you to lead a certain way, that you want to objectively, prayerfully look at the organization. So if you're a sustained success leader, you've always been a farmer, and you've said yes to a situation that requires a turnaround, you'll probably have a bias in you that wants to see it as a sustained success because that's how you have led in the past. But a servant leader means you're going to adjust your leadership to the context of the organization, to the context of the people.
Right.
And if it's a turnaround, you're going to have to lead differently. Or maybe, like me, you've been a turnaround leader in the past, but now you've been brought into a realignment or sustained success. You have got to be sure, and this takes others pouring into you and some humility to realize I have to lead differently this time, because it's not where I've led in the past. It's not the same kind of context.
That's good.
So leaders, match your approach to the context where you find yourself. Thanks for joining us on this episode.
You know, if you listen to the podcast, you know that I love research. I used to lead a research company. So I love when research helps to illustrate a question we have. And one of the questions a lot of people are having is, how do we look to the decline of the family, maybe the relationship around fatherhood and issues of faith and church? Well, again, the Communio nationwide study on faith and relationships actually points to the collapse of marriage, where resident fatherhood fits into that, and how they all point ultimately to a relationship to Christianity and decline in the church. So visit communio.org/study to download Communio's nationwide study on faith and relationships.